Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled Coldest Day on Record. Earlier this evening, President Trump tweeted, "In the beautiful Midwest, wind chill temperatures are reaching minus 60 degrees, the coldest ever recorded. In coming days, expect it to get even colder." And President Trump is correct. The forecast maximum temperature on Wednesday at Aurora, Illinois is only about minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's incredibly cold and will shatter their previous record of minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit set on Christmas Eve 1983. Same story at Dixon, Illinois, the boyhood home of Ronald Reagan. Their previous record is minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and they might not get above minus 20 Fahrenheit on Wednesday. We're looking at some extremely cold Arctic air coming into the United States from an Arctic which climate alarmists have been telling us is very warm and the ice is melting. And climate alarmists aren't happy that their scam is falling apart. Here's a lovely response from a fairly typical climate alarmist. Only a moron would not understand global warming causes huge temperature swings, including really cold temperatures. Only a moron. One of the most fundamental premises of global warming theory is Arctic amplification, meaning that the poles warm faster than the equator does. If the temperature difference between the poles and the equator is getting smaller, that would mean smaller temperature swings, not larger ones. It's pretty hard to account for record cold air coming from a warm, melting Arctic. In 2001, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, milder winter temperatures will decrease heavy snowstorms. In the year 2000, The Independent reported snowfalls are now just a thing of the past, and they quoted CRU climate scientist David Viner as saying, children just aren't going to know what snow is. In the year 2006, the New York Times announced the endless summer. It's not that I don't like 60-degree days and eating fresh spinach out of my garden in December, but the extended growing season is one of the signs of global warming. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic as the sea ice shrinks. 2 years ago, the New York Times announced, spring came early. Scientists say climate change is a culprit. In 2012, the Washington Post predicted that cherry trees would start their blooming process in January. Well, that's now. I don't think cherry trees start blooming when it's minus 36 degrees. 2 years ago, the Washington Post Capital Weather Gang reported that the Arctic is super hot. It isn't clear to me how super hot air produces record cold in Illinois. And here's another more polite response to the president. Glad you asked. The polar vortex is supposed to stay at the North Pole, but dwindling sea ice from climate change has caused the vortex to split in 3 places, and that's why it's cold down here. Polar vortex splits like this will become more common as climate change worsens. And here's a web page from climate.gov which explains how the polar vortex works. It causes very deep dips in the jet stream which bring cold air south. It all sounds so sciencey. We're getting this polar vortex which is bringing cold air south, and it's caused by missing Arctic ice and a warming Arctic. Except for one problem. We had the same polar vortex in 1977 at the peak of the global cooling scare. During January of 1977, Buffalo had so much snow that people were having to find their cars underneath the snow. And it actually snowed in Miami that January. And what did the scientists blame the polar vortex on in the 1970s? Well, here's an article from Time magazine from 1974, another ice age. Scientists have found other indications of global cooling. For one thing, there's been a noticeable expansion of the great belt of dry, high-altitude polar winds, the so-called circumpolar vortex. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the 1970s, scientists blamed the polar vortex on global cooling and increasing Arctic ice. Now they say the exact opposite. They say the polar vortex is caused by global warming and decreasing Arctic ice. This was Science News from March 1st, 1975. The Ice Age cometh. glaciers crushing New York City, cities covered with glass domes to keep them warm. So let's take a step back now and think about this. Which theory makes more sense? The one from the 1970s that cold air is caused by cold, or the current theory that cold air is caused by warm? I think I'm going to have to go with the cold air is caused by cold theory from the 1970s. Call me old school, but I like science which actually makes sense. And at the same time, scientists are telling us that global warming is making it very cold. They're also saying that Winter Olympics is threatened because it's going to get too warm. This is an article from just before the Winter Olympics last year from the New York Times. Of 21 Winter Olympic cities, many may soon be too warm to host the games. But the science enthusiast said, polar vortex splits like this will become more common as climate change worsens. So apparently global warming is going to make winters both too warm and too cold. The amazing thing about this New York Times article from last January is that it was written right before possibly the coldest Winter Olympics on record in Korea. Record-breaking cold, NBCnews.com, the Weather Channel, the number of medical stations and medical personnel has also been increased due to the expected frigid weather. But Winter Olympics weren't always cold like this. In 1932 it was so warm that the Olympics at Lake Placid almost didn't happen. January 16, 1932, Lake Placid, New York. Rain today wiped away the last vestiges of snow. And look at the temperatures in New York City in January of 1932. It was 70 degrees. That's a far cry from the minus 30 degrees Chicago is expecting tomorrow. And to put it in perspective, the 70 degrees in January in 1932 is about 100 degrees warmer than Chicago will be tomorrow. President Trump got it exactly right, but climate alarmists are very angry at him, and they have all kinds of great theories to explain that cold is caused by warmth. It's obvious to them that record cold is caused by warm, melting Arctic air. And of course, their proposed solution to all this record cold is to cut off the fossil fuel supply. Without fossil fuels, tens of millions of people would die in the Midwest tomorrow. Climate alarmists like Mark are not only incredibly arrogant and ignorant, but they're also extremely dangerous to civil society. The functioning of civilization depends on having a cheap, reliable source of energy available to everybody. In 2008, candidate Barack Obama said that his plan would necessarily make electricity prices skyrocket. It is frightening to think how many poor people Obama's policy would have killed had he been able to pull it off. By contrast, tonight I paid $1.74 per gallon for gasoline, the cheapest I've seen in decades. Thank you, President Trump, for your very energy and America-friendly policies. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and crazy climate alarmists for a long time.